The autumn wind swept through the cobblestone streets of Boston with a vengeance that October morning, carrying with it whispers that would soon become roars. In the modest dwelling of the Ashworth family on King Street, 17-year-old Margaret Ashworth pressed her ear against the door of her elder sister's chamber, scarcely daring to breathe. "Victoria, you must tell me the truth." Their mother's voice trembled through the oak. "Is it true what Goodwife Hartley claims she saw?" There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the hearth fire below. Then came Victoria's voice, steady as stone, despite the tempest that surely raged within her heart. "Mother, I am with child." Margaret stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Sister Victoria, pious, devoted Sister Victoria, who had taken her vows at the Ursuline Mission House only 2 years prior, who had dedicated her life to serving the Lord and teaching the children of Boston's poor. It could not be, but it was. Victoria Ashworth had always been the jewel of her family. Born in 1695 to a respectable merchant family, she possessed not only uncommon beauty, chestnut hair that caught the light like burnished copper, eyes the color of autumn honey, but also a sharp intellect that set her apart in an era when women's minds were expected to concern themselves only with needlework and household management. Their father, Edmund Ashworth, had made his fortune importing English goods, and he had ensured his daughters received education beyond what was typical for colonial women. Edmund had been unusual for his time. Having lost his own mother to childbed fever when he was young, raised by a formidable aunt who ran her late husband's printing business, he held unconventional views about women's capabilities. He had taught Victoria Latin, mathematics, and philosophy alongside her brothers when she expressed interest in the works of Mary Astell and other early feminist thinkers. He procured the books for her, though he cautioned her to keep such reading private. Victoria's mother, Catherine, came from old Massachusetts Bay colony stock. Her grandfather had arrived on the Mayflower. Catherine had converted to Catholicism upon marriage to Edmund, scandalizing her Puritan relatives. This act of defiance, this choosing of love and conviction over social acceptance, had profoundly shaped young Victoria's understanding of what was possible for a woman of principle. At 20 years old, Victoria had chosen the religious life not out of desperation or lack of prospects, but from genuine conviction. She had received 3 marriage proposals from suitable men, including one from the son of a prominent Boston attorney. She had declined them all, much to her mother's initial dismay and her father's quiet pride. The Ursuline sisters had established a small mission in Boston in 1712, despite the Protestant majority's suspicion of Catholic orders. The political climate was delicate. England and her colonies were predominantly Protestant, and Catholics faced numerous restrictions. The mission existed on sufferance, careful not to proselytize, focusing instead on charitable works that even the Puritan establishment could not condemn without appearing heartless. Victoria had been drawn to their work among the poor, their schools for girls who would otherwise grow up illiterate, their hospital for the sick who had nowhere else to turn. She saw in their mission a way to live out her faith, while also addressing the practical needs of women and children whom society had abandoned. For 2 years, she had been exemplary. She rose before dawn for prayers, taught reading to the daughters of washerwomen and dock workers, nursed victims of smallpox and consumption, kept meticulous records of the mission's charitable distributions. Even the most hardened Puritan critics of the Catholic mission had grudgingly acknowledged Sister Victoria's good works. She had become a bridge between communities, respected by both the small Catholic population and the dominant Protestant establishment. The mission's Mother Superior, Sister Marguerite, had arrived from France with decades of experience in running such institutions. She recognized in Victoria not just devotion, but organizational talent and diplomatic skill. She had begun grooming Victoria for eventual leadership, teaching her the complexities of managing an institution that existed in constant tension with the surrounding culture. Until now. The unraveling began subtly. Victoria noticed she was tired beyond what her rigorous schedule warranted. Then came the morning sickness, which she initially attributed to bad fish at dinner. When her monthly courses ceased, she tried to explain it away as the result of stress and poor nutrition, but deep within her heart, she knew. She had known since the last time Thomas Blackwell had come to her small cell at the mission, had made his promises, and his demands had left her feeling more soiled than any amount of prayer could cleanse. The scandal broke like a thunderclap over Boston society. Within days, everyone from the governor's mansion to the lowliest tavern knew that Sister Victoria Ashworth was carrying a child. The shock rippled through the 13 colonies like wildfire. News traveled by ship, by horseback, by word of mouth. Letters were written and rewritten, each adding new layers of speculation and judgment. Pamphlets were printed and distributed throughout Boston and beyond. One, titled "The Fallen Sister," a warning against papist corruption, sold over 500 copies in 3 days, an enormous number for the time. Street preachers used her story as evidence of Catholic moral decay. Sermons were preached denouncing the corruption of papist institutions. The Ursuline mission, already operating on precarious ground, faced calls for its immediate closure. Angry crowds gathered outside the mission house, some throwing stones, others simply standing in silent judgment. The reaction was particularly virulent among Boston's Protestant majority. Reverend Cotton Mather, one of the most influential Puritan ministers in the colonies, devoted an entire Sunday sermon to the scandal, titled "The Wages of Sin and the Dangers of False Religion." He used Victoria's fall as proof that Catholic religious institutions were inherently corrupt, that their very structure, unmarried clergy, cloistered life, foreign allegiance to Rome, bred immorality. But the reaction was more complex than simple Protestant Catholic antagonism. Within the small Catholic community, opinion divided sharply. Some viewed Victoria with compassion, others with horror, that one of their own had validated every Protestant suspicion about their faith. The mission supporters, who had worked for years to build tentative acceptance, watched their efforts crumble overnight. Victoria's own family faced social ostracism. Her father found merchants suddenly unwilling to do business with him. Invitations to social gatherings ceased. Young Margaret, still unmarried at 17, saw her marriage prospects evaporate. Their mother, Catherine, faced the particular cruelty reserved for women whose daughters had fallen. Whispers that she had failed in her maternal duty, that her own conversion to Catholicism had somehow led to this catastrophe. What shocked America most profoundly, however, was not merely the pregnancy itself. Tragic falls from grace, while scandalous, were not unknown. Servant girls were seduced and abandoned regularly. Even ministers' daughters sometimes found themselves in such circumstances. though these cases were typically handled quietly, with the young women sent away to have their babies in secret before returning to resume some semblance of normal life. What stunned the colonial world was what came next. Victoria Ashworth refused to hide. The decision to confront Blackwell publicly did not come easily to Victoria. For 3 weeks after confirming her pregnancy, she wrestled with her options. She could flee Boston, perhaps to one of the French settlements in Canada, where a fallen Catholic nun might find more understanding. She could claim the father was unknown, accept the shame, and try to rebuild some kind of life in obscurity. She could do what was expected, disappear, have the baby quietly, give it up, and live out her days in penitence and silence. But as she prayed, as she taught her students, as she watched the women who came to the mission for help, women who had been used and discarded by powerful men, women who bore shame for sins that were not theirs alone, something crystallized within her. She remembered a conversation with her father years before. He had told her about a merchant who had cheated him, who had used his position on the Colonial Council to escape consequences. The powerful, Edmund had said bitterly, write the rules to protect themselves. Justice is a luxury of the wealthy. Young Victoria had asked, then what can be done? Her father had smiled sadly. Sometimes all one can do is speak the truth and let the chips fall where they may. It may not change the world, but it changes you. And perhaps, if enough people speak truth, eventually the world has no choice but to listen. Those words echoed in Victoria's mind as she made her plan. She would not run. She would not hide. She would speak the truth, and if it destroyed her, at least she would go down fighting. The first person she approached was Elizabeth Whitmore, the minister's wife. It was a calculated risk. Elizabeth was known for her piety and her influence, but she was also known for her rigid moral standards. Victoria might have been turned away at the door. Instead, when Victoria quietly explained what had happened to her, Elizabeth's face had transformed. She had gripped Victoria's hands and said, "My cousin, 10 years ago, she drowned, herself in the harbor. Everyone said it was melancholy, but I knew. I knew what he had done to her, but no one would believe me. A magistrate's word against a grieving girl's suspicions." That conversation had been the beginning. Elizabeth knew other women whispered to them, vouched for Victoria. A network began to form. Women who had experienced Blackwell's predation or knew others who had. Women who had kept silent because what other choice did they have? On the first Sunday following the public revelation of her pregnancy, Victoria appeared at the North Church, not the Catholic chapel, but the largest and most prestigious Protestant congregation in Boston. She arrived as the bells tolled for morning service, dressed simply but with dignity in a dark grey dress, her condition now visible to all who cared to look. The congregation fell silent as she walked down the center aisle. Women clutched their prayer books, some in horror, others with expressions harder to read. Men shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Children stared with uncomprehending eyes. The Reverend Josiah Whitmore, a stern man of 60 years who had preached fire and brimstone for 4 decades, stood at the pulpit, his face reddening. "This is a house of God," he thundered, his voice filling the vaulted space. "You have no place here, woman, you who have broken sacred vows, who have brought shame upon yourself and upon the faith you claimed to serve." "I have come to speak truth," Victoria interrupted, her voice clear and unwavering despite the trembling she felt deep in her bones. and I will be heard." The audacity of it left the congregation breathless. Women did not interrupt ministers. Women did not demand to be heard, especially not women who had fallen so spectacularly from grace. Several men half rose from their pews as if to physically remove her. But Victoria had not come alone. Behind her, filing into the church through doors that had been left strategically unlocked, came a procession that made the scandal infinitely more complex. 12 women of varying ages and stations, from merchants' wives to servants, from young girls barely past childhood to grandmothers. They stood beside Victoria in silent solidarity, forming a wall of feminine defiance that was unprecedented in that sacred space. Reverend Whitmore looked to his wife, sitting in her customary front pew. Elizabeth Whitmore stood slowly and deliberately and joined the women. The Reverend's face went pale. "Reverend Whitmore," Victoria said, her voice steady now, anchored by the presence of these women beside her. "I will tell you the father of my child, but first, these women have stories to tell, stories that this community has chosen not to hear for far too long. Stories of a man who has used his power, his position, his wealth to prey upon those who had no recourse against him." What followed was unprecedented in colonial American history. One by one, the women spoke. They told of a powerful man in Boston society who had for years used his position and influence to exploit women of lower station. They spoke of promises made and broken, of coercion, of threats to their reputations and livelihoods if they dared speak against him. The first to speak was Sarah Mills, a widow of 40 who worked as a seamstress. Her voice shook as she described how Magistrate Blackwell had come to her shop 5 years prior, claiming he needed garments made for his wife. He had returned repeatedly, always with excuses to stay longer, to speak privately. Finally, he had made his intentions clear. She could accept his advances, or she could find herself without customers, her reputation mysteriously destroyed by whispers of shoddy work and dishonest practices. "I have 3 children to feed," she said, tears streaming down her face. "What choice did I have?" Next came Ann Porter, just 19, daughter of a shipwright. Blackwell had encountered her at her father's workshop, had praised her beauty, had later appeared at their home with legal documents suggesting her father was in violation of guild regulations, violations that would cost him his livelihood. The violations were fabricated, but who would believe a working man against a magistrate? He made it clear the documents would disappear if I showed him gratitude, Anne said, her voice hardening. I was 16 years old. One after another, the stories came. A tavern keeper's daughter, a teacher at a dame school, a merchant's widow, a maid in a wealthy household. The details varied, but the pattern was identical. Blackwell identifying vulnerable women, using his position to create pressure, making his demands, and ensuring their silence through threats or shame. The man they accused was Thomas Blackwell, one of Boston's most prominent magistrates, a pillar of the community, a married man of wealth and standing who sat on the colony's governing council. He owned 3 ships in the merchant fleet, a tidy, grand house on Beacon Hill, and had been considered a likely candidate for lieutenant governor. Victoria's voice rang out last. Magistrate Blackwell came to the mission in the spring, seeking, he claimed, to make a charitable donation. He was charming, deferential to Mother Superior, full of praise for our work. He came again and again, always with some excuse. bringing books for the school, checking on a sick child his servant had told him about, asking about our needs. He promised the mission would receive funds to expand our school, to serve more children. He promised me that through his influence, the Catholic mission would be granted official recognition, protection from those who would see us closed. She paused, her hand resting on her abdomen. The price for these promises was my virtue. When I resisted, he reminded me of how precarious the mission's position was, how easily a word from him could see us expelled from Boston, our work destroyed, the children we served left, with nothing. I believed I was making a sacrifice for a greater good. I was a fool. The church erupted. Some shouted in disbelief, others called for order. But many, particularly women, listened with expressions that suggested Victoria's story resonated with truths they had long suspected or experienced themselves. Thomas Blackwell, of course, denied everything. He denounced Victoria as a scorned woman, a fallen nun seeking to destroy an honest man's reputation to cover her own sin. He suggested she had taken many lovers and now sought to pin her shame on a respectable member of society. But Victoria had anticipated this. She had spent the weeks since discovering her pregnancy, not hiding in shame, but gathering evidence and allies. She had sought out other women who had suffered at Blackwell's hands. She had collected letters, witnessed testimonies, documented a pattern of behavior spanning more than a decade. More importantly, she had made an alliance with someone unexpected, Elizabeth Whitmore, wife of Reverend Josiah Whitmore, and a woman of considerable influence in Boston society. Elizabeth had long suspected Blackwell's true nature. Her own cousin had been one of his victims years before, driven to such despair that she had taken her own life. But in that era, what could be done? A woman's word against a magistrate's was worthless. Victoria had changed the calculation. By refusing to hide, by speaking publicly, by gathering multiple witnesses, she had created something that could not be easily dismissed. The scandal divided Boston. Families argued over dinner tables. Church congregations split. Some stood firmly with Blackwell, insisting that a man of his stature could not possibly be guilty of such crimes, that this was clearly a conspiracy to destroy him. Others, particularly women who had their own experiences with powerful men's predations, found Victoria's account entirely credible. The colonial governor, faced with mounting pressure from both sides, ordered an official inquiry. It was an extraordinary step. Magistrates were rarely called to account, and certainly not at the word of women. The proceedings that followed in November of 1717 became the most talked about event in colonial America. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. People traveled from as far as Philadelphia and New York to witness what many were calling the trial of the century. Victoria testified for 3 full days. She was composed, detailed, unshakable. When Blackwell's lawyers attempted to shame her, to break her down by calling her a whore and a liar, she responded with facts, with dates, with specifics that could be verified. The other women testified as well. Their stories formed a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. Blackwell's defense grew more desperate. He called character witnesses who spoke of his piety, his charity, his devotion to his wife and children. But Victoria had one more revelation that shifted everything. On the 4th day of testimony, she produced a letter written in Blackwell's own hand, proven authentic by comparison to his official correspondence. In it, he promised Victoria that if she would show him kindness, he would ensure the Ursuline mission received a grant of £200 and official protection from colonial authorities. The letter's date corresponded exactly with Victoria's timeline. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Blackwell's face went white, then red. His wife, present throughout the trial, rose and walked out, her silence more damning than any words could have been. The verdict, when it came, was not what anyone expected. Colonial law and social custom were not prepared for such a case. Blackwell could not be convicted of rape. Victoria had not fought him, had not screamed, had acquiesced under duress. In the eyes of the law, this was not force but seduction, however coerced. But the court did find that Blackwell had abused his position, had engaged in conduct unbecoming of a magistrate, and had brought disrepute upon his office. He was removed from the governing council, stripped of his magistracy, and ordered to pay substantial sums to Victoria and the other women who had testified. More significantly, the case set a precedent. For the first time in colonial American history, a group of women had successfully challenged a powerful man and been believed. The ripples would continue for generations. Victoria never returned to the Ursuline order. The scandal had made that impossible, despite the mission's support for her. But she didn't disappear in shame, as society expected. Instead, she used the money from the settlement to open a home for women in distress, unmarried mothers, widows, women fleeing abusive situations. Elizabeth Whitmore became her partner in this venture, lending it the respectability Victoria's name alone could not provide. When Victoria's daughter was born in March of 1718, she named her Grace, for the grace she hoped to show others, and the grace that had carried her through the darkest period of her life.